Hello, my name is Robert Trevino, and this is Generational Warfare. Starting with the overview, I will be covering the concept itself, the generations in detail, the theory article fifth generation, and the U.S. anticipation of and developing response in these changing forms of conflict. Generational warfare is best introduced as a conceptual framework rather than a rigid scientific theory. It helps explain why the dominant style of warfare changes over time and why battlefield success does not always equal strategic success. The first 4 generations remain the core of the model, with a possible 5th generation still debated. This generational theory was proposed by William S. Lind and his co-authors in a 1989 Marine Corps Gazette article titled "The Changing Face of War into the 4th Generation." Those co-authors were various other Marine Corps officers that helped produce the framework. The original point was to explain why powerful militaries could remain tactically superior, yet still struggle to convert that superiority into success. Generational warfare argues that major changes in technology, military organization, and society alter the dominant style of war. Each generation shifts the center of gravity of warfare from formation to firepower, to maneuver, to political endurance, and possibly to cognition, as I'll explain here in a second. It does not claim that the change is clean, total, or scheduled. Older generations often survive inside newer conflicts, which is why the model works best as an interpretive framework rather than a strict predictive law. The generations build on top of each other, and each subsequent generation is usually presented as growing from the need to counter the previous one. Here are the generations outlined. I will go more into depth with them in a second. The first generation warfare is about order and drill. The second is about industrial firepower and attrition. The third generation is about maneuver and operational dislocation. Fourth gen is about insurgency, legitimacy, and political endurance. And the possible fifth argues that the center of gravity may be cognition, ambiguity, and influence over decision-making. This theory is useful, but it is by no means perfect. It is primarily a conceptual framework rather than a precise scientific model, and it does not explain every conflict neatly. One of its biggest limitations is that generations often overlap, even within the same war. It is no universal agreed starting point for the first one, and no clear ending point for any. Napoleonic warfare still belonged to the first generation, but it showed maneuver elements later associated with the third, for example. First generation warfare, now going into depth, is the age of line and column. Because firearms were relatively slow and inaccurate, commanders relied on discipline, drill, and tight formations to concentrate force and maintain control. Units fought as formations instead of as dispersed individuals. Success depended on keeping order under fire and breaking the enemy line first. The Napoleonic Wars remained the clearest example of this model operating at scale. First generation warfare was not primitive for its time. It was a rational answer to the weapons and command systems available. Because muskets were slow to reload and not very accurate, commanders relied on unit cohesion to concentrate fire and maintain control. In that context, battlefield order mattered more than individual initiative. The transition away from this style happened when firepower improved enough to make a dense formation too exposed and costly. The Industrial Revolution changes everything from this point. It helps produce the canonical bullet, transforms the scale of firepower, and creates the industrial and logistical foundation for global war. From this point forward, warfare is no longer only about battlefield discipline. It's about production, transportation, communication, the ability to sustain violence on a mass scale. Comes in second generation, the age of industrial firepower. Here, the dominant problem becomes how to apply mass artillery, machine guns, and industrial logistics effectively. Command tends to be centralized. Battle plans are methodical, and victory often comes through attrition. The clearest case here is World War I, where industrial firepower and endurance become the defining military problem. The American Civil War features several second-generation features like rail movement, the telegraph, entrenchment, and faster firepower. World War I, though, is still the clearest example of second-generation warfare. Trench systems, wire, machine guns, and artillery made defense dominant and made frontal assault extremely costly. That stalemate pushed armies to search for a new answer, which leads directly into third-generation warfare. Third-generation warfare shifts away from attrition and towards maneuver. The goal is not simply to kill more enemy forces than the other side kills of yours. The goal is to disrupt the enemy system, get behind strong points, isolate forces, create collapse. Combined arms become decisive because different capabilities are used together to produce speed, shock, and disruption. A classic teaching example is Germany's 1940 campaign on France and the Balkans. The technology of third generation matter, but the deeper change is conceptual. Tanks, radios, aircraft, and motorized logistics enabled speed and flexibility. But the real shift was toward initiative, mission-type orders, and rapid exploitation of enemy faults. The purpose was to bypass strength, disrupt command, and collapse the enemy's operational system before it could recover. The blitzkrieg is best understood as operational dislocation, rather than simply fast movement. The importance of third-generation warfare goes beyond World War II. Of course, it shaped the modern operational art and influenced US and NATO maneuver doctrine, still used today. It showed coordination, tempo, and operational design can matter more than just mass alone. It also reminds us that later generations does not need to replace conventional warfare. Instead, they layered on top of it, which is why third-generation logic still matters in high-intensity conflict today. Fourth-generational warfare expands the battlefield beyond organized armies alone. Here, the weaker actor often avoids direct conventional warfare and instead targets political will, legitimacy, and endurance. In other words, the center of gravity shifts from battlefield destruction toward the enemy's willingness to continue fighting. Iraq and Afghanistan are widely used as examples because they show how battlefield superiority does not guarantee strategic success. Common fourth-generation methods include insurgency, guerrilla warfare, sabotage, terrorism, propaganda, and political mobilization. Tactical actions are meant to create strategic exhaustion rather than battlefield decisiveness alone. The weaker sides try to survive, recruit, and outlast the stronger side. Time becomes a weapon itself, and media effects also become part of the fight. This is why the stronger state can win militarily but still fail politically. Fourth-generation warfare is not just irregular violence. It is a contest over legitimacy, endurance, and political will. It blurs the boundaries between war, politics, society, and information. And this is why a stronger state can win repeated battles and still lose the war. This point is central to understanding why fourth-generation warfare matters today. Before getting into the fifth-generation debate, it is important to stop at the gray zone warfare. Gray zone conflict operates below the threshold of open war and relies on ambiguity, deniability, and indirect coercion. In that sense, it still reflects the logic of fourth-generational warfare because it targets political will, legitimacy, and endurance. At the same time, it expands conflict into cyber operations, information warfare, economic pressure, and other forms of non-traditional competition. That makes gray zone warfare an important transitional space between classic fourth generation and whatever may be emerging beyond it. Some scholars argue that warfare is now moving beyond the classic fourth age. The claim is that the target is increasingly perception, trust, and decision-making itself. Cyber tools, AI, and synthetic media make this more possible because they allow strategic pressure to scale in new ways. The category is still debated, which is why I present it as a question rather than an established fact. One way to think about what a mature fifth generation might look like is through the different identities that scholars assign to it. Lind, for example, suggests that what people call fifth generation warfare may not be new at all, but rather sit as set of tactics nested within the third or fourth generation. Greg Abbott treats it primarily as a war of information and perception. The People's Liberation Army of China emphasizes a change in the function of warfare itself, and a 360 ISR view from the Air Force perspective presents it as a continuous global battle of narratives. Many theorists therefore place the battlefield in a civilian sphere and not just a military one. My own assessment is what many people call fifth generation warfare is better understood as a midpoint inside the fourth generation. The goals still look mostly fourth generational because they remove legitimacy, endurance, narrative, and political effect. My take about fifth generation is about achieving political and military goals faster than the enemy can react before resistance harder into insurgency. If each later generation is built to bypass the strengths of the last, then current geopolitics may be foreshadowing that shift. The real pattern is speed, intensity, and precision. Recent precision operations suggest preference for disabling capabilities or forcing political outcomes without the burdens of long occupational campaigns that last 20 years. In the sense, fifth generation warfare points towards decisive disruption rather than extended control. This slide shows that the United States is already anticipating many of the risks associated with fourth generational conflict and a possible fifth generational environment. US officials are concerned with conflict below the threshold of declared war, election interference, cyber attacks on critical infrastructure such as the electrical grid, and informational manipulation on social media. In response, the United States is developing stronger cyber resilience, better AI and data integration, and greater coordination across the military intelligence and civilian private sector institutions. What the United States is developing is a more rapid response to cyber threats, more interagency coordination, and cyberkinetic enhancements of current units. It is also working on public-private coordination because so much critical infrastructure and communications capacity sit outside of the federal government itself. And this matters because future conflict does not just run through military bases. It runs through civilian networks, digital platforms, and public perception. My final assessment is that the first four generations remain the clearest and most useful part of this theory. Each generational shift shifts the dominant path to victory, and from formation to firepower, to maneuver to political endurance. But the case for the fifth generation is serious and not settled. That is why I describe what is happening currently as a transitional stage between the fourth and possible fifth generation. I'll take your questions now. These are my citations, by the way.
Thank you. Robert, thank you very much.